No one wanted the alien girl covered in blood, so I took her in, and now she calls me mate. They told me not to open the door, not to look outside, not to get involved, and most importantly, not to touch her, because whatever she wasn't human, and rules out here weren't suggestions, they were survival instructions carved into every reinforced wall of every forgotten outpost like this one, Outpost K7, a place so far off the main trade lanes that even the sun seemed to pass it by reluctantly, the kind of station built for temporary occupation that became permanent simply because no one wanted to come back for it. The snow outside never stopped falling, not even when the sky was clear, as if the planet itself was trying to bury its history under layers of ice and time. And when I first saw her through the cracked visor of the outer gate camera, I didn't think, I just felt that pull in my gut that something wasn't right. She wasn't moving at first, just slumped in the snow like some discarded cargo, forgotten in the middle of the refugee yard we had stopped using years ago. She was curled around herself in a way that wasn't just defensive, it was protective, as if trying to shield something inside her that hadn't been broken yet, and she trembled, not from the cold but from something deeper, something older, and I don't know what made me override the protocol that night. Maybe it was the way her ears twitched like a wounded animal, or how one hand still clutched something under the thick mess of blood and fur, or maybe it was the simple fact that no one else had come for her, not even to bury her. And I didn't want to be that kind of man anymore, the kind who watched through a screen and waited for someone else to care first, so I pulled on my coat, a heavy one patched with years of wear and frostbite burns, opened the lock with a trembling hand, and stepped out into the storm. The wind howled like something alive, carrying the scent of ionized metal and smoke from the old power relay fires we could never fully extinguish, and the cold hit me like a punch to the lungs, sharp and immediate, but I didn't stop. Didn't hesitate as I moved closer to the small, bloodied figure in the snow, my boots crunching through the icy dust and broken debris of what used to be a functional transit hub, now a ghost town of half-buried crates, rusted containers, and cracked solar panels still tilting toward a sun that never gave enough. When I reached her, I could see the details more clearly. Her hair was long, tangled and white as new frost, but matted with blood at the tips. Her skin was pale with a faint purplish hue, and her fox-like ears were twitching weakly, one of them torn at the tip like it had been bitten or ripped. Not clean but savage. Her eyes opened just a sliver when I knelt beside her, and they glowed faintly like molten silver, reflective, otherworldly, and I said something dumb like, "Hey, it's okay, I'm not here to hurt you," even though that was probably the last thing she'd believe after what she'd just survived, and she flinched when I reached toward her but didn't move away, her body too exhausted to flee. And I saw then what she'd been holding, a small carved pendant, broken and stained, clutched so tightly her claws had cut into her own palm, drawing blood that shimmered faintly blue in the darkness. Without thinking I pulled off my jacket and wrapped her in it. She was freezing, shivering so violently I thought she'd break apart, like a machine whose joints had frozen in place and were trying to move. Anyway, so I did the only thing I could think of. I picked her up and carried her, ignoring the warning buzz in my wristband, the automated voice repeating that unauthorized alien contact was forbidden, that medical isolation was mandatory, that exposure risk was critical, but I shut it all out, because she didn't weigh more than a bundle of wires and bones and it felt like if I let go she'd vanish into the wind, just another casualty to the cold logic of this place. I brought her inside, past the malfunctioning airlock door that only opened if you kicked it twice and swore in the right rhythm, and laid I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid she would hurt me, but because I couldn't stop watching her, couldn't stop wondering who she really was or what it meant when she looked at me and said that word, mate. It echoed in my mind like the distant hum of failing machinery, steady, persistent, quietly unsettling. Maybe she didn't understand it the way we did. Maybe it was just a broken whisper of a language half learned in desperation or an instinct carved into her bones by evolution. Or war or both, but the way she said it, the way her fingers reached for me not in panic but in need, as if I were something real and grounding in a world that had spun too far out of orbit, made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, not since the war, not since I had a name that meant something. Now I was just Eli, the last tech specialist in a forgotten outpost designed for cargo ships that never came anymore. She was asleep now, curled in my jacket on the bench by the heat lamp, her Breathing shallow but steady, the blood clean from her face though streaks of it still lingered in her hair like dried ink, and even as the sun began to rise through the cracks in the overhead shield, painting the floor with cold white light that flickered as the generators strained, I didn't look away. Her body was so still it scared me, and yet each time she exhaled I felt like I'd survived something impossible. Her legs were tucked under her like a child hiding from thunder, and her tail, long and white with a tufted end, was wrapped tightly against her side like a living question mark. When she stirred, it was slow, cautious, like an animal waking in unfamiliar terrain. Her ears twitching before her eyes fluttered open with a kind of fear you don't learn, you're born with it. A kind of fear that lives in your bones and reminds you that trust is earned one breath at a time. I moved slowly, careful not to startle her, offering her a tin cup of water and a food bar. Nothing special, just the standard synthetic fare we all lived on out here, but to her it might have been a feast. She took the cup with both hands, delicate but firm, sniffed the water like it might betray her, then drank it in small sips, her throat visibly working with each swallow, and when I handed her the food, she looked at it like it might bite her, turned it over in her hand, and then finally took a cautious bite and chewed with surprising delicacy, as if tasting more than just flavor, tasting safety, tasting the silence between us. Her tail curled beside her like a protective ribbon, twitching slightly every time I moved, and her eyes never left me, not with suspicion, but with a deep, unsettling curiosity, as if she were trying to understand what I was, or why I hadn't left her to die like everyone else. Her pupils were wider now, not like human eyes but closer to a nocturnal predator's, reflective and bottomless, and when she finished eating, she tried to stand. I moved to help her, instinctively reaching out, but she lifted one hand slowly and shook her head. There was something proud in her expression, something fragile but fierce, like a wounded star refusing to dim. She pushed herself upright, shaky but proud, and took one careful step, then another, her legs trembling beneath her weight but refusing to give out. Her posture was upright yet defensive, like every breath hurt but she would take it anyway. Her clothes were barely holding together, just scraps of fur and cloth clinging to her figure, revealing glowing bruises along her ribs and the curve of her thigh that pulsed faintly under the light, not from blood, but from something else entirely, something alien. Her body was lean and lithe, built for movement and balance, every motion carrying an elegance that felt instinctual, like she'd been born in motion, born to survive. And when she turned to face me again, her eyes locked with mine, and she crossed the floor with quiet certainty until she stood so close I could feel her breath against my skin. It smelled faintly like frost and earth, wild and clean. It happened sometime in the dead hours of the second night, when the generators were low and the outpost was cloaked in silence so thick even the wind outside seemed afraid to howl. I had drifted into a light doze, still holding Lyra in my arms, her tail wrapped loosely around my leg like a sleeping promise, her breathing slow and even against my chest, and I remember thinking for the first time that maybe this strange impossible bond could lead somewhere other than ruin. Maybe we were past the danger, past the blood and the wreckage, and that was when the emergency alarm screamed to life like a dying animal, jolting me awake and sending Lyra into a crouch beside me with her claws bared and her ears pinned flat against her skull. I stumbled to the control panel and slapped the override, but the signal wasn't coming from inside. It was an external ping, proximity breach from the northern gate, something big and moving fast across the snow, and Lyra hissed low in her throat like she already knew who it was, or worse what it was. I looked at her and asked what's wrong, and she didn't answer right away, just stared at the door like it had betrayed her once and might do it again. Then she said in a voice I almost didn't recognize, "They followed me. I thought I lost them, but they hunt in packs and they don't stop." I asked who, and she simply whispered the word wardens, and I felt the blood drain from my face because I'd heard the stories, tales told by traders and mercenaries, about a paramilitary alien group that acted like both cult and law enforcement, purging species they deemed defective. And suddenly it all made a terrible kind of sense. The glowing wounds, the way she never asked for help, never cried, only endured. She had been marked by them, and now they were here, and they had tracked her to me, to my outpost, to my stupid fragile world of routines and half-repaired machines. I grabbed my rifle from the wall, a worn-out kinetic model that hadn't seen use since the siege of Helix Ridge, and shoved a fresh cartridge into the chamber. Lyra watched me with those glowing eyes and said, "If they come through, Don't let them take me alive. I told her that wasn't going to happen, not while I was breathing, and she didn't argue. She just stepped closer and did something unexpected. She pulled her dagger from the strap on her thigh and pressed the hilt into my palm. It was warm from her skin, curved and alien in design, etched with symbols I didn't recognize, and she said it was her father's, the last thing she had left, and if I dropped it she would haunt me. I smiled despite the panic rising in my gut and promised I'd keep it close. We took position behind the main blast door, and for a moment the silence returned, thick and cruel, until the outer gate exploded inward in a hail of metal and smoke, and from the white swirl of storm stepped three figures, not soldiers, not quite. They moved like predators, tall and lean, clad in segmented armor that shimmered with dark violet hues, their faces hidden behind obsidian masks with no eyes, just breathing slits and pulsing veins of red light, and the tallest among them held a chain in one hand, not a weapon but a leash, the end of which was dragging something behind him that I never got a good look at, because Lyra let out a scream that was not human, not even close, and lunged. I tried to stop her but she was already moving, faster than I thought possible, her claws slashing through the air with a fury I didn't recognize, not the gentle creature who whispered mate and slept curled beside me, but a warrior of fire and blood, her body a blur of motion as she struck the first warden across the mask, sending sparks into the air. I raised my rifle and fired at the second, the recoil slamming into my shoulder as the kinetic bolt tore into his chest and knocked him backward into the snow, but he got up, twitching like something reanimating from the dead, and that was when I realized these things didn't bleed. Not like us, not like her. They moved without fear, without hesitation, and they were. It turns out preparing for an alien death call to return and drag your glowing fox-eared not quite girlfriend back to space prison is way harder than it looks, especially when the solar panels are only working at half capacity, the backup power cells are leaking, and every piece of military-grade gear in my stash smells like engine coolant and old regrets. Lyra was moving better now. Her wounds bandaged and her strength returning fast, too fast honestly, because by the time I had the second turret half-mounted she had already gutted a pair of drones and was using the leftover casings to craft what I can only describe as murder jewelry. I caught her threading serrated wiring into a necklace like it was some kind of warrior art piece and she looked up and said with complete sincerity, "It will protect my throat from their blades," which would have been noble if it didn't also make her look like a runway model from a dystopian fashion show. Meanwhile I was struggling to get a thermal sensor aligned and the damn thing kept flashing error codes in 12 languages including one I'm pretty sure was just mockery. She came over, crouched beside me, tilted her head and said, "Your machines are weak," and I said, "No, they are old, like me," and she blinked, thoughtful, then reached out and slapped the unit once with the flat of her palm and suddenly it whirred to life like it had been afraid to disappoint her. I just stared and said, "Remind me never to make you angry again." She gave me a look that I think was supposed to be playful but her eyes still glowed when she smiled and that made it difficult to breathe properly, especially when she leaned in close to inspect my work and her hair brushed my cheek and I had to pretend I wasn't having a minor cardiac event. We got the defenses up by mid-morning, or what passed for morning on this frozen rock. The sky was gray, the snow was heavier, and my coffee reserves were down to one final sachet of something that tasted like mud and battery acid but worked well enough to keep me upright. I made 2 mugs anyway, one for her, which she sniffed with suspicion before sipping and immediately gagging so violently I thought she was choking. I tried to help but she pushed me away with one hand and wheezed, "How do you survive drinking this?" And I told her it builds character, and she said, "It builds poison resistance, which is not the same," and then proceeded to drink the rest while making a face that looked like betrayal had been distilled into a liquid form. After that I decided she'd earned a break, and I told her to rest while I scavenged the storage shed for anything remotely useful. She nodded and curled up on the bench like a cat, tail flicking, hair draped over her face, and for a moment I thought she might actually sleep but then she said from under the jacket, "If I die, you have to bury me with my blade." I called back without thinking, "If I die, just delete my browser history," and there was a pause before she sat up with an expression I didn't know she could make. Somewhere between horror and curiosity. "What is a browser history?" she asked slowly, and I realized too late that I had opened a door that should never be opened. I said, "Nothing important," and she narrowed her eyes, slowly repeating, browser history, like she was adding it to a kill list. I left quickly, telling myself it wasn't fear, just strategic withdrawal. Inside the shed I found 2 motion sensors, a flare gun with 3 flares, and a half-melted protein dispenser that still worked if you hit it hard enough. When I returned, Lyra was standing on the roof, scanning the horizon like a sentry, her white hair whipping in the wind, the makeshift armor she'd strapped across her chest catching the gray light and sharp metallic edges. She looked like something out of a legend, except for the part where she saw me and shouted, "Did you bring more of the poison drink?" I shouted back, "It's called coffee, show some respect." She jumped down, landing beside me like gravity didn't apply to her, and took the sensor from my hand with a small nod. "Oh." She kissed me like she was claiming something the universe had denied her for too long, her lips pressing hard against mine as if she needed to memorize the shape of my mouth before it was erased from her mind. There was no hesitation in her hands as they slid around my neck and into my hair, her fingers tightening with a desperation that wasn't about lust, but about holding on to something real, something warm, something hers. I pulled her closer, felt the heat of her body as she pressed into me, her breath coming faster, her voice a soft trembling whisper against my ear as she said my name, not as a question or a plea, but as a vow, the kind you make with skin and silence. Her tail curled around my waist and she pulled me backward into the shelter with a surprising strength, not rough but firm, like this was something she had decided and nothing would make her stop. The room glowed with a faint hum of auxiliary lights still flickering above us, casting our shadows long and golden against the walls that still smelled faintly of coolant and scorched wiring. I followed willingly, helplessly, because there was no war in her eyes anymore, no blood or fear. Just that same fire I had seen flicker in her the night she first called me mate. She moved with purpose, her movements sharp and fluid as she stripped away the makeshift armor she had worn, the straps falling away one by one to reveal smooth skin marked by faint glowing scars that seemed to pulse in the low light like constellations mapped across her body. Her body was a map of survival, of pain, and resilience, and now it was trembling under my touch, not from fear but from anticipation. Her breath warm against my chest as she looked up at me with a mix of hunger and vulnerability, and I saw in her expression the kind of openness that only comes when someone decides to let down every wall, the kind of look that trusts the hands about to touch them more than their own instincts. Her voice was softer now as she said, "I don't want to forget you, not even the way you taste," and then she pulled me down with her, guiding my hand to the side of her neck where her pulse was wild and unsteady. Her body pressed against the padded floor where we had once laid her for recovery, now transformed into a place of quiet reckoning. She leaned into me, nuzzling the line of my jaw, her breath warm against my skin, and I could feel every part of her pressing into me, skin to skin, no layers left between us, no weapons, no armor, only the sound of our breathing and the way our hands moved like they were searching for something just beneath the surface. I kissed the side of her throat and she gasped, her back arching slightly, her fingers tightening around my wrist as she pulled me closer still, her body fitting perfectly against mine, her hips shifting to meet me in a rhythm that started slow and deliberate, like a dance learned in silence, the kind only bodies remember even when the soul forgets. She wrapped her legs around me and whispered something in her native tongue that I couldn't understand but felt like poetry against my skin, soft syllables melting into me as if they were written for this moment and this moment alone. Her eyes glowing brighter now, not with power or rage but with something far more intimate, and when I moved deeper into her she gasped again, this time louder, her head falling back as she held onto me like I was her anchor in a world still sliding into chaos. I kissed her lips again and she responded with a passion that melted away every doubt I had left. The movement between us grew more urgent, more fluid, her tail wrapping tighter as her hands explored my back, tracing every scar, every mark like they were chapters in a book she had waited her whole life to read, her body moving in perfect sync with mine as if we had done this 1,000 times before in another life, each motion more deliberate than the last, not just for release but for memory, for meaning. She whispered my name again and again, not out of habit but with meaning, each syllable drawn out like a S-E. She fell asleep in my arms, her breathing slow and steady, the warmth of her body still lingering on my skin as the outside world faded into a gentle blur of silence and flickering lights. I didn't move for a long time, just lay there watching the snow swirl beyond the cracked viewport, feeling something like peace take hold in my chest for the first time in years. And maybe that should have been the first warning sign, because in a place like this, peace doesn't come without a price. I must have dozed off because when I opened my eyes again, the lights were red, the warning system humming low and steady like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. I sat up fast, the cold hitting my skin where her warmth had been, and I looked around for her, for Lyra, but she was gone. Not gone as in vanished into thin air, but gone as in standing at the center of the room, dressed in the armor she had stitched together from scraps and wreckage, her face unreadable, her body still, too still. I called her name but she didn't answer, only stared at me like I was someone she didn't know, and then she said a word I hadn't heard before, a word in her language, clipped and sharp like a command, and the floor beneath me shifted, the air thickened, and something behind the wall clicked open. A hidden panel I didn't know existed sliding away to reveal a small spherical drone I had never installed. It hovered forward slowly, lights blinking, then projected a holographic display into the center of the room, and what I saw there made my blood turn to ice. It was me, or someone who looked like me, standing beside Lyra, except this version of me had no scars, no beard, no age in his eyes, and he was smiling as she knelt before him, her hands resting on his chest. And he said in a voice that was unmistakably mine, "Initiate imprint protocol." I stared at the image in disbelief, trying to understand what I was seeing, and Lyra finally spoke, her voice low and distant, like she was speaking through someone else's memories. "You were never supposed to wake me," she said. "You were never supposed to bond." And I asked her what she meant, demanded she explain, but she just turned her back and reached out to the console, tapping a sequence of buttons with practiced ease, and the drone floated closer, scanning me with a red light that burned across my skin like static. I tried to move but something froze my limbs, a tingling paralysis that crept from my fingers to my spine, and then the projection changed again, this time showing a series of logs, stamped with the emblem of a private science division I'd only ever heard in whispered rumors, Azurus, a black site development program that had been terminated decades ago after rumors of genetic weaponization and psychological manipulation leaked to the public. The log played, and a voice I didn't recognize said, "Subject Lyra, designed for adaptive emotional imprinting, neural bonding, and selective reproductive escalation in field conditions. Current handler imprint, designation Oren Voss," my full name, and the breath caught in my throat as I stared at the words glowing in front of me, unable to deny what they meant. I wasn't just some random survivor who found a girl in the snow. I was her handler, her creator, or some version of me was, and now she was looking at me like the ghost of a man she had once obeyed. I told her I didn't remember any of it, that I wasn't that person, but she shook her head slowly, sadness flickering in her expression. "You don't remember because you made sure you wouldn't," she said. "You wrote yourself out of the protocol, a fail-safe in case you fell in love." I wanted to argue, to scream, to deny that I could ever be part of something like that, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew it was true. Too many little things made sense now, the way she responded to my voice, the way her body seemed to know mine, the way she called me mate as if it had always been programmed into her. She hadn't fallen for me because of who I was now, she had fallen because someone had designed her to, and that someone was me. I didn't run at first. I stood there like an idiot staring at the locked bulkhead with a dagger clenched in one hand and the prototype core glowing in the other like I was holding pieces of a puzzle I couldn't begin to solve. My breath came in clouds as the cold bit through the last of the shelter's warmth and the storm outside howled like it had been waiting for this moment. I should have moved. I should have trusted her plan. I should have done the logical thing and followed the escape route she opened for me. But logic was having a meltdown inside my skull because everything I thought I was had just been rewritten by a version of me I didn't even remember programming, and now the girl I thought I was protecting had just locked herself inside a death trap to buy me time, and I couldn't even argue with her about it. I kicked the nearest wall hard enough to bruise my foot and shouted at the silent steel like maybe yelling would reverse the laws of physics. Then the COMM crackled alive and I almost dropped the core, except it wasn't Lyra's voice, it was a stranger's. Male, smooth, unsettlingly calm, and it said, "Target confirmed, Oren Voss, prototype handler designation reactivated, retrieval unit inbound." And that's when I realized this wasn't over, not by a long shot, not even by a medium shot. This was the part of the story where everything was supposed to start making sense and instead it got weirder. I sprinted into the tunnel, the walls shaking as the first wave of explosions hit the outer shell of the station, and I could hear the distinct pulse rattle of Warden energy rifles discharging in bursts, followed by Lyra's war cry echoing through the metal corridors like a wildfire wrapped in sound. I didn't look back, not because I didn't want to but because I knew if I did I'd go back and that would make her sacrifice meaningless, and we were way past the point of meaningless sacrifices. The tunnel was narrow and half frozen, lit by flickering emergency beacons that made everything look 10% more haunted than necessary, and I swear one of the lights kept flickering in Morse code that translated to "you're screwed," which was probably just my brain being unhelpful but still incredibly accurate. After what felt like a mile of slipping on frost and swearing at the architect who thought metal stairs in a snow tunnel was a good idea, I stumbled into a secondary command module I didn't even know existed and nearly shot the maintenance droid. Sitting on the floor sipping coolant like it was a martini, it looked up at me with a single blinking eye and said, "You're late," which was rich coming from a robot with icicles on its chin. I asked what this place was and it replied, "This is where the real you used to hide," and then it winked, and I swear if I hadn't been on the verge of existential collapse I might have thrown it across the room. Instead I told it to explain and it spun one arm dramatically and activated a wall panel that revealed a data terminal full of encrypted logs, most of which were labeled things like "don't open this" and "absolutely never open this," and one that said "for when you finally screw it all up," which felt like a direct insult. I ignored the warnings and opened the last one, and there he was again, the clean-cut version of me with no scars and smug confidence, sitting at the same desk, saying, "If you're seeing this, then congratulations, you've officially done what we all agreed you never would, fall in love with her." I stared at the screen like it had slapped me, and he continued, "Listen, Orin, or Eli, or whatever name you're using to run from yourself now, I know you're angry, confused, probably wondering why she was built the way she was and why you were the one who signed off on it. Here's the truth, she wasn't supposed to be real, she wasn't supposed to feel anything. The Lyra we created was meant to be a tool, a beautiful, capable, programmable companion for long-term diplomatic missions, but then she started dreaming, not just reacting but anticipating, writing new code inside herself and you, idiot. I didn't know how my legs managed to move after that fight. Maybe it was adrenaline, maybe it was the echo of her voice still ringing in my ears like the last signal from a fading star, or maybe it was something deeper, something buried in the code of who I used to be and the man I had become through fire, frost, and failure. Either way I stumbled down that icy ridge with frozen fingers wrapped tight around the prototype core and her father's dagger still dripping with the blood of my own damn clone. The snow crunched beneath my boots like glass, each step a silent scream from my battered body. Above me the sky was a swirl of violet clouds and black ash, the storm howling like the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten missions. The Warden ship was still there, untouched, silent, its obsidian hull steaming under the sleet as if defying the planet itself, and for a moment I thought maybe they had gone back inside, regrouped, recalculated, but then I heard it, not gunfire, not metal, but the distinct crackle of plasma slamming into reinforced plating followed by a scream that didn't sound human, or maybe sounded too human in all the wrong ways. I slipped into the edge of the clearing, ducked behind the wreck of a transport sled half buried in snow and old blood, and caught sight of her, Lyra, standing at the mouth of the outpost's shattered defense wall, her left shoulder bleeding again through a tear in her armor tunic, her chest heaving with effort and defiance, but still standing like a storm-given form, surrounded by 3 Warden elites whose armor was torn, sparking, stained with dark fluids, their movements erratic, like they'd just been dragged through hell and spit out. Her hands were empty now, her blade lost somewhere beneath the snow or buried in one of the ribs, but her stance never wavered, her legs braced wide, her eyes locked forward, and I saw in her face not fear but the cold, fierce calm of someone who had already chosen how this story ends and wasn't waiting for permission. I didn't call out to her, didn't risk distracting her at the wrong moment. Instead I slipped around the edge, circling toward the exposed vent shaft that led back inside the outpost. The core pulsed in my grip like a heartbeat that didn't belong to me, like it knew what I was planning and didn't like it one bit. I reached the vent, crawled in on hands and knees, the cold biting at my skin through the ripped seams of my coat, each metal rung of the shaft echoing like a drum beat in my skull. The tunnel was tight, narrow, filled with the scent of old oil and charred insulation, but familiar, and when I emerged behind the enemy line, the noise hit me like a punch, static, shouting, the low rumble of something about to detonate, some machine angry at being woken. I didn't hesitate, didn't think. I launched myself at the closest warden from behind, slamming the core into the back of his helmet with all the force I had left, watched as it cracked open like a dropped egg, sparks spraying into the snow. The feedback pulse from the device shorted his suit and dropped him twitching to the ground in a heap of smoke and metal. The second one turned, but too late. Lyra was already there, moving like a phantom, grabbing his wrist, twisting it with brutal precision until his weapon spun free and landed in the snow, her claws driving into the seam of his armor just below the ribs where no plating protected him. He dropped to his knees, choking on his own blood. I took on the last one, both of us staggering through the snow, trading savage blows, his strength cold and mechanical, mine fueled by fury and memory and the kind of blind momentum that turns weakness into survival. He landed a hit that sent me sprawling, my vision exploding with stars, the prototype core skidding across the ice out of reach. I rolled onto my side, coughing blood, my lungs screaming for air, watched as he loomed over me, blade raised for the killing strike, and then suddenly Lyra was there, catching his arm mid-swing and slamming her forward into his faceplate so hard the helmet